Hello everyone, welcome to my channel BOMBSHELL Gossip 24. Here's my father. Remy had rehearsed the confession in a dozen mirrors. He had watched the words like a private film inside his head, the way his lips would shape them, the way his breath would hitch, the small, dreadful silence that would follow. He had imagined Deke's face turning from confusion to disbelief to that brittle, wounded comprehension that lingered at the edges of every family that had been struck by secrets. But the truth lived in the hollow of his chest like an object too heavy to carry and too precious to put down, and rehearsals would not ease the weight. He found himself standing outside the Sharp family lake house at dusk, a place of wind and water and something like refuge, its windows glowing with the low light of someone setting the evening, of photographs and history stacked like quiet confessionals. Deke's truck was in the drive. Someone had left a pair of rain boots tipped by the back door. A garden hose coiled like a sleeping animal. The house smelled faintly of coffee and cedar. Remy had not expected to find Deke at home. He had planned, in some cold part of himself, for the conversation to be quick, antiseptic. A phone call, a guarded voicemail, maybe a letter. But when Deke had answered his uncertain knock with that lopsided, sultan-like smile that had always disarmed people, Remy realized that nothing would be quick. Nothing would be antiseptic. "Remy," Deke said, and the name on his lips sounded like recognition and surprise braided together. He let the screen door close with a small, polite thud and ushered Remy into the kitchen, where a teapot hissed and a radio murmured an old tune. The house was lived in and storied, a cluster of postcards from travels he had never taken, portraits of a life stitched in with small, ordinary loves. Deke had become, in the months since he'd re-emerged into the Forrester periphery, a man oddly at peace with himself, or perhaps he had simply learned to appear so. It made the truth waiting under Remy's tongue feel even crueler. They sat at the round kitchen table, the kind Deke always kept for late-night sandwiches and quick confessions. Steam rose between them. Remy's hands, which had never been steady in crisis, trembled as he wrapped his fingers around the warm mug. "You sounded urgent on the phone," Deke said. His eyes were softer than Remy had remembered, kind, open, an easy trust that had cost Deke a life and earned him strange loyalties in return. "What's going on?" How to begin? Remy's mind fluttered. There were flashbacks, a dozen small faces, the scent of hospital antiseptic, the memory of his mother's hand, the first time he learned to hide something from somebody who loved him. He thought back to the folder that had landed in his lap 2 weeks earlier, an official envelope stamped with an old hospital letterhead and a name that pulsed like a promise on paper. He remembered the slow, almost scientific way he'd read the line that meant everything. Biological father, D. Sharp. The paper trembled in his hands like a living thing. He began, and the sound didn't hold. Deke's brow creased. You okay?" The word father hovered in the air like a challenge. He breathed it into the kitchen's low light. "Here's my father," Remy said, and the sound of it was both a release and a wound. It landed on the table like an accusation. It felt unfair. It felt inevitable. For a long moment, Deke said nothing. He stared at Remy the way someone stares at a stranger they're trying to recognize in a crowd. A slow crimson flushed up Deke's neck, a warmth that told Remy the words had landed deeper than he'd hoped. "How can that be?" Deke whispered, and his mouth was smaller with disbelief than Remy had expected. Remy saw the way Deke's eyes flitted, from his face to the edges of the room, searching perhaps for a camera hidden in the wallpaper, for a trick. Remy had feared this. The first response would be reflexive denial, a protective thing in Deke, a man who had rebuilt himself from ruins more than once. "It's true," Remy said. "I found papers. Old hospital records. I don't know why I didn't know. I don't know why no one told me. But it's true." Deke's hands came up, as if to stop a tidal wave. His voice cracked. You mean," he searched for words and at last found them, blunt and stunned. "A child I never knew." "It's me," Remy said. "It's me, Deke. I'm your son." If Deke's life had been a book, Remy imagined, someone had ripped out a chapter and set it on fire. Deke's jaw worked. He looked suddenly very old, as if decades had been pulled from him in a single breath. "Oh," Deke said. Not shock. Not anger. Just the single, small syllable of someone whose world had just shifted. The kitchen hummed. Somewhere on the radio, an old love song swelled and then receded. Remy felt, absurdly, like he was underwater, watching everything through a thin membrane. He had rehearsed the moment he'd tell Deke, but not the way Deke would be remade in front of him. How? Deke asked finally. How did this happen? Remy swallowed. The story, the history, had many corners and shadows, none of them clean. It's complicated, he said. My mother, she named her first husband on the paperwork, a man I thought was my father. But the records, they list you, Deke. It's official. DNA results, birth documents. I've had tests. They match. Deke's hand fluttered to his mouth as if to hold a sudden, unspeakable answer inside. For a few heartbeats he sat in silence, the kind of silence that fills with the noise of the world and strips it bare. Remy, he said, and the use of his name now felt different, like someone reaching for a fragile object. Why didn't you say something sooner? Remy looked down at his mug and traced a shallow ring in the condensation with his finger. He wanted to tell Deke everything, the whole of not knowing, the crooked sense of belonging he'd carried, the way he'd built his life around a false anchor, but the truth had teeth and could bite hard. I needed to be sure, he said. I needed proof. I didn't want to ruin everything if I was wrong. Deke's laugh was a small, incredulous sound. It carried a grief Remy had not wanted to hear. Ruin everything, Deke repeated. What have you ruined, You came to me because you thought I was your father. That's not ruin. That's... He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Remy looked at Deke, saw the man he had read about in headlines and seen on social feeds, the reformed criminal, the man who'd carved out a quieter life. He thought of how Deke had shown up in the lives of people like Hope, a man with a complicated past and a generosity pressed into the lines of his face. I don't know what this means, Remy said honestly. I don't know if you want me in your life. I don't know if there's room. Deke's face softened and then tightened. He leaned forward, both hands hovering over the wood of the table, as if steadying himself against a wave. There's room, he said at last. That's a lot to take in. I need time. He exhaled slowly, the act of making space. But I don't want you to think you're a burden. We'll figure this out. Remy wanted to believe him, wanted to let the warm rush of joy that threatened his chest flood in. But he also felt the shadow of years in which he had been unmowed. Deke, he said, and in his voice was a small, bracing honesty, there's more. I don't know how my mother kept this from me so long. There are letters I haven't read, a name I don't recognize, people who are complicated. I need your help. Deke's eyes narrowed with concern. Who else is involved? Remy's lips went thin. Sheila's name came up in one of the documents. There's an old case file. It's messy, Deke. At the utterance of the name, Deke's hand tightened. The room seemed colder. Sheila had been many things in his life, a ghost maker, an impossible tangle of beauty and danger. For Deke, the mention of Sheila was like an open wound. Sheila. Deke's voice was small. Are you saying she has something to do with this? Remy nodded. I don't know what yet. But her name is in the record, and I thought your insight might help. You know things I don't. Deke's laugh was bitter. God help us, he muttered. He stood up, pacing the small kitchen like a man walking the edge of a memory. If there's any web of lies, I want to see them. I want to know the truth. If I'm your father, Remy, I want to know why no one told me. The night curled around the house like a blanket. The two men sat with a fragile truce of information, Remy's fear and Deke's dawning reckoning, both of them feeling the old scaffolding of their lives shift. Remy left Deke's house with a folder in his bag and an ache in his chest. He'd asked Deke not to tell anyone yet, a plea for discretion laced with the fear that a premature revelation could blow apart more than just their new, tentative connection. But secrets, Remy knew, were often like cracked glass. They were fine until pressure came, and then they cut. He drove home through the dark, the city lights blurring like a procession of distant stars. The folder held the fragile bones of his past. Birth certificates, old obstetric notes, a typed letter with a signature that looked like a name scrawled in a hurry. He read, under the sodium glow of his kitchen light, every detail he had already read once before with the clinical detachment of someone assembling a case. But now the line biological father, D. Sharp had a face, a voice, a motorbike of contradictions called Deke. Back in his apartment, Remy let himself sink onto his couch and imagine the life he might have had if the truth had been told. Would it have been different? Would he have known himself sooner? He understood intellectually that the past did not change with a revelation, only the present rearranged itself. The next morning, the Forrester campus looked like a world he'd been shaped to resist. Chic glass buildings, models pouring out into sunlight, the hum of fashion as efficiency. But the world no longer cut cleanly into categories. Remy walked into the design building feeling like a man edging into a room with a glass floor. Everything was visible but the steps felt unsure. Word traveled fast in the Forrester orbit. Stephanie's old laugh, the gossip in the coffee room, the way one person's shadow could fall across dozens of lives in an instant. Remy spoke in measured sentences, carrying the dossier in his bag like contraband. He wanted to tell someone, maybe because he needed a witness, but he feared the ripple. If he told Hope, if Sheila heard, and the thought of Sheila hearing made Remy's skin crease, the consequences might be catastrophic. He spent the afternoon at the studio, trying to anchor himself in work as he had done all his life. Fabric swatches lay across his desk like scattered maps, delicate silks, crisp linens, designs waiting for the right hand to stitch them together. He used the smallness of pattern and thread as therapy. But everywhere his eyes fell, he found the new, strange possibility of belonging. "I'm," called a voice, Finn's voice, and Remy looked up to find Finn at his station, blue-eyed concern soft and immediate. Finn had been one of the first to take him in at Forrester, an anchor in the stormy politics of design family. Finn had stitched him into projects and family dinners and the small, quiet rituals that make a life less lonely. "You okay?" Finn asked, wiping his hands on a towel and leaning onto the counter. He was attuned to people in a way that was almost clinical, perceptive and tender. Remy's chest tightened. "I'm dealing with something," he said. He watched Finn's face. He weighed the cost of confession. Finn's eyes narrowed, protective. "If you want to talk, I'm here. You don't have to carry it alone." Remy almost told him. He wanted to, more than he had wanted anything in months. There was a ferocious comfort to telling someone when the words were too heavy to hold. But instead, he offered only, "Thanks, Finn. I appreciate it." Finn's lips pressed into a small smile. "Lunch later?" "Yeah," Remy said. He needed the routine to keep him from spiraling. That evening, after the studio closed and the campus let out into the nighttime hush, Remy called Deke. He'd asked for a quiet morning with no announcements. He needed to process his own reverb before introducing other voices. Deke answered, voice rough with sleep, the house's background noise suggesting cups and the rustle of the daily. "How are you holding up?" Deke asked immediately, the line of worry in his voice unmistakable. Remy sighed. "I don't know. It's strange." Deke was quiet. "You want me to come by?" "No," Remy replied instantly, a reflexive protective nod to the secret he wasn't ready to share publicly. "Not tonight. I just wanted to talk." For the next hour they spoke in stilted confessions and small hilarities, the kind of conversation that stitches two people together in a terribly human way. Deke talked about his late nights and the bills that still had to be paid, about the odd security of small-town rhythms. Remy talked about fabric and color and the way he felt suddenly like two lives had to share a single heart. When the call ended, Remy pinned the phone between his shoulder and neck and arranged the folder on his counter. There were details he needed to confirm, holes he needed to fill. He made a list, hospital records to call, old doctors to track down, perhaps even a lawyer if questions needed legal paper. He slept that night in a restless half-dream, the kind of sleep where memory and possibility braided into the same tapestry. At 2 a.m., he woke and walked to the window, looking out at the lights. There, like a series of tiny, indifferent beacons, the city blinked, and Remy felt the tug of two lives pulling him in unpredictable directions. The life he had known, stitched into the fabric of his days at Forrester, and the new, raw life of being someone's son. The discovery had not only rewritten the labels on his birth certificate, it had rewritten the architecture of what he imagined as family. 3 days later, an envelope slid under his apartment door. The handwriting was unfamiliar, tight, angular, and Remy's heart did an odd little skip. She had always disliked surprises that knocked at midnight. He picked the envelope up with care. There was no return address. Inside, a single sheet of paper. The ink was faded, the letterhead old hospital paper, but the message was clear and deliberate. "Meet me at the pier tomorrow at noon. Come alone. A friend." Remy stared at the words, a slow, volcanic thrill running through him. Was it a trap? A confidant? A person with a stake in old truths? He weighed his options with the careful arithmetic of someone who had been burned by secrets before. He picked up his phone and dialed Deke. Voicemail. He left a terse message, his voice steady until it wasn't. Deke. Check your messages. I got something. I can't go alone. He waited for a callback that did not come. When he arrived at the pier the next day, the sky was a taut blue, and gulls argued above the water. The place smelled like salt and old varnish and the sort of freedom that made you feel untethered. He sat on a bench and watched waves feather the shoreline, a restless human in a landscape built for motion. She came up behind him, soundless as a shadow. She had been a type of woman Remy imagined often in his life, older than him, with a coat that had seen better days, and a gaze that had measured the world with sharp practicality. She carried a small leather satchel. You Remy? She asked. Her voice had a husk to it that suggested too many cigarettes and too many hard nights. Her eyes were certain, almost clinical. Yes, Remy said, rising. Who are you? She slid into the bench beside him and did not answer for a long moment. Then she said it, clean and soft and precise. My name is Claire. I worked in records at St. Mary's years ago. I kept a lot of things. Things people mislaid or were told to misplace. She smiled, a small, bitter thing. I kept yours. Remy's breath snagged. Why? Claire's face folded into something like pity. Some of us kept things because we thought the truth mattered. Because people like you deserve not to be sold a life built on someone else's lies. He opened his mouth to ask the 100 practical questions. Why Claire? Why now? Why send a note? But she sifted into the satchel and produced a small pack of papers. X-rays, a crumpled discharge note, the echo of someone's initial scrawl. Your mother came in here once, Claire said. She was scared. She signed forms. She left. She never looked back. She asked me to not let certain things become public. She drew breath. Years passed. People left. You came back. Someone opened a file by accident. I thought, maybe now is the time. Remy's fingers hovered over the X-rays like over fragile parchment. The image held an infant shadowed against an expectant mother. It felt like the past, a library of the living, catalogued and then hidden. Why Deke? Remy asked, even though he already knew. Why would she list him? Claire's gaze was threaded with something grey. Maybe she wanted a name associated with stability. Maybe she thought it would buy you a better life. Maybe she feared what Sheila would do if she told the truth. Her jaw tightened. Sheila's name came up in a lot of files here. People in the past were terrified of the kind of attention Sheila brought. Remy's heart hitched. The presence of Sheila's rumor in the files knitted the present to a shadowed past he didn't understand but which always arrived in Forrester law like a storm. But why tell me now? He asked. Because you deserve the truth, Claire said simply. And because whatever this is, however it ends, you should know the parts you missed. Remy folded the papers and put them in his jacket like reversing a small theft. He thought of Deke, of the man who had offered to hold a lamp up to the dark. Thank you, he said to Claire. His voice was softer than he expected. She nodded and rose. Be careful, Remy. People don't like their pasts reopened. As she walked away, Remy's gaze followed the rhythm of her steps out onto the pier. He felt something loosen inside him, the tightness of years of absence giving way not to resolution but to possibility. The next hours would be a labyrinth. The next choices would be crucibles. He looked down at his phone, at the image of Deke's number, and then dialed. Deke, he said when the line clicked open. I need you. There was silence on the other end for a long breath, and then Deke's voice, steady and plain, I'm here. The chapter of his life that had once been a closed book had opened like an invitation, or an accusation. Either way, Remy realized with a strange clarity, you couldn't put a secret back into a chest once the lid had been pried up. Days later, the world of Forrester momentum would spin around fabrics and fittings and brand launches, but for these two men the axis had shifted. They sat in Deke's backyard under a canopy of maples, the April light slanting and warm. Papers were spread between them like a trail of breadcrumbs. Both records, old case notes, a tangle of signatures and dates. Deke had called in favors, dug through old contacts, and for the first time in a while he looked lost in the old, raw sense of a man trying to reconcile what might have been with what had been. Remy watched him with an odd tenderness. They were both, suddenly, pilgrims of a shared past. They spoke at length, not just about facts but about the geography of absence. Deke would confess things that made Remy feel both closer and further away. Late nights he had spent in police precincts, a run-in with a woman whose name had the edge of scandal, long periods he could not account for. He would say things quietly, "I was young once," or "I made choices I didn't know how to own," and Remy would feel the air around them shift in small, seismic ways. "You're my son," Deke said one evening, looking directly at Remy across the picnic blanket. The words weren't triumphant, they were fragile, an offering. "I can't change the years that weren't ours, but if you'll have me, if you want me, I'll try to be there." Remy's throat ached. He wanted to say yes with the force of someone released, with the right of being known, but the truth was more complex. He had been built, by half-truths and careful lies, into a shape that fit the world as it had been given to him. To accept Deke was to accept a rewriting of his interior map, father, not stranger, a new place at a table he had not known existed. "I don't know what I want yet," Remy said honestly. "But I know I want the truth out in the open. I don't want to have it over my head like a debt. I want to be able to face it." Deke nodded. "Then we face it together." They both believed, in that small moment of fragile truce, that together might be enough. But soap opera truth seldom moves in straight lines. It curves, it ambushes, it finds the places where human frailty meets old grudges. In Remy's case, the curve came in the form of Sheila's reappearance in the periphery, not as a direct presence but as an echo. A woman at a coffee shop staring at a paper with a name that no one had intended to surface. A whispered rumor that traveled, as gossip does, faster than any press release. Remy had thought to wait, to pace himself, to give Deke time. But secrets like his had the temperament of water, restless, urgent, seeking cracks. At a Forrester launch party meant to celebrate a new line inspired by coastal palettes, a server knocked a tray and a glass shattered in the foyer like the beginning of a prophecy. "Sheila saw you," someone said later, in the crush of people and champagne, and whispered congratulations. "She was asking about your name." Remy's skin grew hot. He had tried so hard to keep the lid on the box of his past, convinced that patience and slow, careful truth would make it less explosive. But Sheila's interest reversed any carefully laid plan. "Sheila's a fire," Deke said when Remy told him later that night. They stood on the steps of his house, the party's glow a distant warm halo behind them. "If she wants a story, she'll make one. She's drawn to drama like a moth. She loves pieces of people that burn." "What if she tells Hope?" Remy asked, voice small. "That would complicate things," Deke said flatly. "It would complicate everything." The minutes after that felt like thin ice. There was the present, the studio, the job, the friends, and there were the hidden rails of family lying under it, rusting but still dangerous if struck. Remy fell into drafts and fittings and the need for concentration as a kind of first-level defense. He sewed seams like someone braiding a rope to hold on to. But even as he worked, the knowledge that someone like Sheila might pull the thread out of his life made his fingers jitter. On a humid Tuesday morning, he found himself sitting across from Sheila in a small cafe that smelled of espresso and lemon tarts. Sheila had called him, or rather, someone at Forrester had, and asked for a brief meeting. Remy had hoped the world could hold both truth and decency, but Sheila was a force of nature, and her curiosity rarely came without consequence. Sheila arrived like a storm wrapped in silk. She wore dark sunglasses and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. When she slid into the booth opposite him, her perfume struck, sweet, dangerous, the girl's aura of chaos that Remy had read about in old whispered stories. "You have my attention, Remy," Sheila said, voice smooth as a cat's purr. "Rumor has a way of getting rude. My name's been in files. Is that true? Am I relevant to your history?" Remy was tenacious about not letting panic show. "Claire gave me files," he said. "Old hospital records. They show Deke as my biological father. That's all I know." Sheila smiled, and because it was Sheila, her smile did not spread to her eyes. "Deke? Interesting. He's always been a private man." "You don't know him," Remy said before he could stop himself. The words spilled out, quick and raw. "He's trying. He's been reaching out. He wants to be a part of this." Sheila's eyes narrowed. Is that what you want? She asked, her voice small and perfectly harmless, deadly as a pin. Remy hesitated. The present moment felt like a crucible. I don't know yet, he said honestly. I need time. Sheila's smile returned like a blade under silk. Time can be a luxury. Or a weapon. Be careful, Remy. People have fooled themselves with time before they realize it's run out. Her words were a bell. But she left the booth with the same nonchalance she had arrived with, the echo of her heels like a punctuation mark. Remy watched her go, the taste of fear like metal in his mouth. Sheila wasn't the sort who let things lie. If she sniffed an angle that involved the sharp past and Forrester present entwined, she would not hesitate to exploit it. The thought that Hope might be caught in the middle made his stomach curdle. Later that afternoon, Remy's phone chimed with a text. A single line, we need to talk. Hope. He read the message in a slow, controlled heartbeat and then the words in his head slipped like a loose thread. He's my father. Remy's hand hovered over the keyboard. If he wrote the truth, he would be throwing a match onto tinder. If he didn't, he would be holding someone else's future in his mouth. He chose to wait. The story had to live somewhere between each heartbeat and the next. Remy discovered that truth is not always about a single utterance. Sometimes it is a string of moments that accumulates into revelation. He had told Deke, and that confession had created something like a private axis that turned not simply toward connection but toward complications. Across the city, other actors tuned into their own costumes and plots. Hope, in her own orbit, would soon notice the shift. Steffi would be a friend with opinions poised and sharp. Sheila would keep her eyes on the prize because Sheila always did. Weaving through the days, Remy felt both buoyed by the possibility of an entirely new map and terrified by the knowledge that maps could also be wrong. He had not yet told the person who mattered most in the ways of biology and heart, Hope. Deke had not yet told Hope that a man she trusted might be the father of a child he had never known. Remy, who had been born into absence, now had the option to relieve someone else of a work of absence. If he chose to speak, or not, he would change lives. On a humid evening, as fireflies began to tilt the twilight like tiny, ardent punctuation marks, Remy stood at the edge of the Forrester terrace. The skyline was a tangle of steel and glass and history. He closed his eyes and felt the full, complicated weight of the secret. When you open a window to someone's past, you can never predict what winds will blow into the room. He made himself a promise, the kind only a man who has been kept from simple truths makes to himself. He would not be the architect of someone's ruin. He would not let a secret fester and then explode. He would choose honesty, however raw and terrible, when the truth was needed. And yet, as he walked home through the quiet streets, he felt the shadow of Sheila's words, Deke's fragile offering, and the hush of Claire's paper fold into a whisper. Family, he was learning, was less about blood and more about the willingness to stand when the storm came. He only hoped he could stand. The bell of destiny rang faintly, the next act was approaching. The next revelation would not be a small thing. It would be the kind that sets an entire set of lives spinning. At the edge of the night, under the hush of city lights, Remy decided it was time to tell Hope. He knew from the look on his own heart that when you told the truth, you never could take it back. But sometimes, he thought as he walked forward, the most dangerous thing you could do was to hold it in your hands. And the next morning, he would knock at Hope's door and let the story unfold.